Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. The first time Buddy dropped an old brass key onto Daniel Brooks' kitchen floor, it sounded like nothing more than a piece of forgotten junk. The second key made him pause. By the fifth, he stopped laughing. By the seventh, he found himself standing at the window every evening with a knot in his stomach, waiting for the familiar scrape of paws on the porch. Buddy had never been the kind of dog to wander far. For nearly 6 years, the gentle golden retriever followed the same quiet routine through their peaceful neighborhood outside Columbus, Ohio. Every morning Daniel worked from home. Every afternoon Buddy napped by the back door, and every evening they walked the same sidewalks lined with maple trees and white picket fences. Nothing about Buddy had ever been unusual until 3 weeks ago. Now, sometime between 4 and 5 every afternoon, Buddy disappeared without making a sound. He always returned within an hour, breathing normally, his tail wagging only once before carefully laying another weathered key at Daniel's feet. None of them matched. Some were tiny, some were heavy, one looked decades old, another still carried a faded blue plastic tag with numbers Daniel couldn't read. There was no collar attached, no address, no explanation. Just another silent delivery from a dog that refused to tell his secret. Daniel searched nearby parks, checked the sidewalks, even knocked on a few neighbors' doors asking if anyone had lost old keys. Every answer was the same. No. A few people chuckled and called Buddy a clever collector. Others joked that he had discovered pirate treasure. But Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that something about the keys felt wrong. They weren't random souvenirs. Buddy never played with them. He never chewed them. He never buried them in the yard. Each time he came home, he would place the key down with surprising care, stare directly into Daniel's eyes for several long seconds, then quietly walk to the back door and sit facing the woods beyond the neighborhood until sunset. That stare unsettled Daniel more than the keys themselves. It wasn't excitement. It wasn't guilt. It looked like expectation, as if Buddy was waiting for Daniel to understand something he simply couldn't explain. The following Friday, Daniel made up his mind to keep Buddy inside for the afternoon. At exactly 4:17 p.m., Buddy stood abruptly from his bed, walked to the back door, and let out the softest whine Daniel had ever heard. When the door stayed closed, Buddy didn't bark or scratch. Instead, he lowered his head, glanced once toward the tree line beyond the fence, then looked back at Daniel with an expression that felt strangely urgent. A minute later, Daniel unlocked the door. Buddy bolted outside, not toward the park or the street, but straight into the woods behind the neighborhood. Daniel watched until the golden fur vanished between the trees, then quietly reached into a drawer, pulled out the tiny wireless camera he had bought months earlier, and whispered, "I'm sorry, Buddy, but I need to know where you've really been going." The next morning, Daniel woke up hoping the strange routine had finally ended, but Buddy was already sitting quietly beside the back door before sunrise, not asking to go outside, not wagging his tail, simply watching the woods through the small window, as if he had spent the entire night waiting for daylight. That silent patience unsettled Daniel more than frantic barking ever could. Buddy had always greeted every morning with the joyful energy of a dog who believed each day held a new adventure. Now he barely touched his breakfast, sniffing the bowl before returning to the door without eating more than a few bites. Daniel knelt beside him and gently scratched behind his ears, expecting the familiar lean of trust, but Buddy only rested his head against Daniel's knee for a moment before turning his eyes back toward the trees. There was no fear in those eyes. There was no excitement either. There was only quiet determination mixed with a sadness Daniel had never noticed before. Throughout the day, Buddy wandered from room to room without settling anywhere for long. He paused beside the living room window, then the kitchen window, then the laundry room door, always searching toward the same stretch of forest behind the neighborhood. Every few minutes, he seemed to listen for something too distant for human ears. Sometimes one ear lifted while the other remained lowered, and he froze completely before slowly relaxing again. Daniel tried distracting him with an old tennis ball, then with his favorite rope toy, even offering a long walk through the nearby park. but Buddy showed almost no interest. Children called his name from across the sidewalk. Neighbors smiled as they usually did, yet Buddy barely acknowledged them. It was as though the cheerful dog everyone knew had quietly placed every ounce of his attention somewhere beyond the tree line. That afternoon, Daniel spread the 7 old keys across the dining room table. None of them belonged to his house. None matched his car, his mailbox, or the storage unit he rented downtown. They varied in shape, color, and age, but one detail suddenly caught his attention. Every single key showed fresh dirt packed into the tiny grooves near the teeth, as though each had been lying outside for quite some time before Buddy found it. Daniel brushed away a little of the dried soil with a paper towel, wondering how one dog could repeatedly discover objects that everyone else had somehow overlooked. When he looked up, Buddy was standing only a few feet away, staring at the keys with heartbreaking intensity. He did not bark. He did not move closer. He simply watched them, almost as if he were checking that they were all still there. As evening settled over the neighborhood, Buddy carried his worn blanket to the back door instead of his usual sleeping spot beside the couch. He curled into a tight circle, keeping his nose pointed toward the woods even after darkness covered the yard. Daniel switched off the lights and prepared for bed, but just before climbing the stairs, he heard a faint metallic sound behind him. He turned to see Buddy gently nudging one of the old keys across the hardwood floor until it stopped directly in front of the back door, where it rested beneath the moonlight spilling through the glass, and Buddy quietly lay beside it without taking his eyes off the darkness outside. The following afternoon, Daniel activated the tiny camera and secured it beneath Buddy's collar while pretending they were simply getting ready for another walk. Buddy stood perfectly still during the entire process, something he had never done before. Usually he wiggled with excitement the moment his leash appeared. This time he barely blinked. He waited until Daniel stepped away, then walked directly to the dining room table where the old keys still rested in a neat row. Instead of sniffing them, Buddy carefully nudged them one by one into a straight line with the tip of his nose. When he finished, he looked at them for several seconds before quietly turning toward the back door. Daniel watched the strange ritual without understanding what it meant. At exactly 4:17 in the afternoon, Buddy slipped through the open gate and disappeared toward the woods again. Daniel remained inside, determined not to interfere, trusting the camera to answer the questions that had been haunting him for weeks. The first live images showed Buddy following a narrow trail between towering oak trees. But what surprised Daniel was not the route. It was the stops. Every few hundred feet, Buddy paused beside ordinary objects that no one else would ever notice. An old fence post, a cracked bird bath hidden behind vines, a fallen mailbox lying beside an abandoned gravel road. At each location, Buddy lowered his head for only a second before moving on without digging, barking, or searching around. It looked almost as if he were checking invisible landmarks only he understood. Then something even stranger happened. Buddy reached a weathered wooden bridge crossing a shallow creek. Instead of crossing immediately, he placed one front paw on the first plank and waited. Nearly 30 seconds passed in complete stillness. His ears shifted slightly as though listening for a distant sound carried by the wind. Only after that silent pause did he continue across. Daniel replayed the live feed twice, wondering why a dog would hesitate at the exact same place for no visible reason. The deeper Buddy traveled into the woods, the less random his movements appeared. He never wandered in circles. He never chased squirrels or rabbits. He ignored every distraction that would normally capture a retriever's attention. His path was precise, deliberate, almost memorized. Daniel felt a growing weight in his chest. Whatever Buddy had been doing out there had clearly been happening far longer than he realized. As daylight began to fade, Buddy suddenly veered away from the trail and approached the edge of an overgrown clearing. The camera shook gently as he disappeared through waist-high grass. For several long seconds, the screen showed nothing except tangled weeds moving softly in the breeze. Then Buddy emerged carrying another old key, larger than any of the previous ones, its rusted ring catching a brief flash of sunlight. But instead of heading home immediately, Buddy did something Daniel had never seen before. He walked to the center of the clearing, carefully placed the newly found key on the ground beside 3 small stones arranged in a perfect triangle, stepped backward exactly 3 paces, sat down without making a sound, and remained there facing the empty woods as if he were patiently waiting for someone who never came. Daniel barely slept that night. He replayed the camera footage over and over, pausing at every strange stop Buddy had made, hoping that one hidden detail would suddenly explain everything. Instead, every replay only made the mystery feel heavier. The carefully arranged stones, the silent waiting in the clearing, the growing collection of forgotten keys, none of it looked accidental anymore. Yet none of it made sense either. The next morning, Daniel decided to ask around the neighborhood once more, carrying photographs of the keys on his phone. Most people politely shook their heads, but one conversation changed everything. Mrs. Harper, who lived 2 streets away, stared at one of the pictures before quietly mentioning that several residents had recently complained about missing spare keys kept beneath flower pots, inside fake rocks, or hanging behind decorative signs. They were old backup keys that most families rarely used, but enough had disappeared over the past month for people to begin talking about it during neighborhood association meetings. Daniel felt the color drain from his face. He wanted to explain that Buddy always brought the keys home instead of hiding them, but even as the words formed in his mind, they sounded weak. How could he prove that his own dog was not the one stealing them? By lunchtime, the rumors had already begun spreading. A delivery driver joked that the famous neighborhood retriever had become a locksmith. 2 parents quietly pulled their children closer when Buddy walked past during their afternoon stroll. Nobody accused Buddy directly, yet the smiles that had once greeted him were replaced by uncertain glances and uncomfortable silence. Buddy seemed to notice the change immediately. For the first time in years, he slowed his pace whenever someone stepped aside to avoid him. His tail remained low, not tucked in fear, but hanging with quiet confusion, as though he could not understand why familiar faces no longer welcomed him. Daniel tried to reassure himself that everything would clear up once he uncovered the truth, but the pressure kept building. Later that afternoon, an officer from the local police department stopped by after receiving several non-emergency reports about missing spare keys. The conversation remained polite, yet every question carried the same unspoken concern. Had Buddy ever been left outside alone? Could he have wandered onto private property? Had Daniel considered keeping him indoors until things were sorted out? Daniel answered honestly, but with every response he felt less certain. He remembered the camera footage of Buddy emerging from the clearing with another key. From the outside, it looked exactly like what everyone feared. Even Daniel could no longer explain what he had seen without sounding unreasonable. After the officer left, Daniel sat quietly at the kitchen table while Buddy rested beside the back door with his chin on his paws. Between them lay the growing row of weathered keys, no longer mysterious keepsakes, but pieces of evidence pointing in the wrong direction. Daniel reached down to pet Buddy, but instead of lifting his head, Buddy gently nudged the leash hanging beside the door, then looked toward the woods once again. There was no excitement in the gesture. It felt like a silent plea. Daniel closed his eyes for several long seconds before making the hardest decision he believed he had ever made. He picked up the leash, called the veterinary behavior clinic across town, and scheduled an evaluation for the very next morning, convinced that if Buddy's strange obsession could not be explained, someone else would have to stop it before the situation became even worse. The following morning arrived with a silence that felt heavier than the day before. Buddy climbed into Daniel's truck without resistance, settling onto the back seat as though he already understood where they were headed. Halfway to the veterinary behavior clinic, Daniel stopped for coffee at a small convenience store on the edge of town. While waiting for his order, he noticed an elderly maintenance worker struggling to unlock a weathered utility cabinet beside the parking lot. The man sighed, emptied an entire ring of keys into his palm, and tried them one after another with growing frustration. None fit. Buddy, who had been quietly watching through the open truck window, suddenly let out a single short bark unlike any Daniel had heard before. It was not loud or anxious. It sounded almost corrective. Before Daniel could react, Buddy jumped down from the truck, trotted to the passenger door, and gently picked up one of the old keys Daniel had absent-mindedly left inside a paper bag after collecting them from the kitchen table that morning. Carrying only that single key, Buddy walked straight toward the maintenance worker and carefully placed it on the pavement beside the cabinet. The old man smiled politely, assuming the dog was simply playing, but when he glanced at the key, his expression changed. He bent down, picked it up, and without much expectation slipped it into the cabinet lock. The door opened on the very first turn. Everyone stood frozen. The maintenance worker looked back and forth between Buddy and the key with genuine confusion. He explained that the original cabinet key had disappeared weeks ago, forcing the town to order an expensive replacement that had still not arrived. Daniel quickly apologized, explaining that his dog had somehow been bringing home random old keys for several weeks. The worker frowned and examined the brass key more closely before pointing to a tiny stamped number barely visible beneath years of dirt. The same number, he said, was used by the city's public works department to catalog maintenance locks decades ago. Daniel felt a chill run through him. Until that moment, he had assumed every key belonged to private homes. Now one of them had unexpectedly returned to the exact place where it belonged. As they continued toward the clinic, Daniel pulled the remaining keys from the paper bag and looked at them differently. Several carried faint scratches, tiny letters, or worn markings he had never bothered to examine. None looked random anymore. At the clinic, the veterinary behavior specialist, Dr. Melissa Grant, listened patiently while Daniel explained everything from the disappearing afternoons to the mysterious collection of keys. She did not interrupt. Instead, she quietly spread every key across her desk beneath a bright examination lamp. After several minutes, she reached for a magnifying lens normally used to inspect identification tattoos on rescued animals. One by one, she studied the keys in complete silence. Finally, she looked up at Daniel with thoughtful eyes rather than skeptical ones. She admitted she was not interested in the keys themselves nearly as much as the remarkable consistency of Buddy's behavior. Dogs driven by compulsive habits usually collected objects of similar shape or smell without any pattern. Buddy, however, ignored countless objects every day and selected only keys that appeared connected by something neither of them understood. Before Daniel could respond, Dr. Grant gently gathered the keys into a small evidence tray instead of handing them back. Then she calmly said that before anyone decided Buddy had developed a behavioral problem, they needed to find out exactly where every single one of those keys originally belonged, and she offered to help Daniel begin tracing them one by one. Dr. Melissa Grant spent the rest of the afternoon calling every organization she could think of, reading the tiny stamped codes from each weathered key, while Daniel sat quietly beside Buddy in the examination room. Most numbers led nowhere. Some belonged to buildings that had been demolished years ago. Others matched maintenance records that no longer existed. Just as Daniel began believing they had reached another dead end, Dr. Grant received a call from the county archives office. An employee there recognized several of the identification codes immediately. They had all been assigned decades earlier to public access lockboxes placed along old emergency service routes that wound through the forest outside town. Most residents had forgotten they ever existed because modern electronic systems had replaced them years before. Curious, Dr. Grant asked for a historical map. 20 minutes later, a faded survey arrived by email. She spread it across the examination table and carefully marked every location connected to the recovered keys. Daniel stared in disbelief as a clear pattern slowly appeared. The keys did not form a random collection at all. They created a continuous path stretching through the woods behind his neighborhood, ending at one isolated property near the abandoned clearing Buddy visited every afternoon. Dr. Grant looked at Buddy, then back at the map. She quietly suggested they postpone the behavioral evaluation and follow the route before drawing any conclusions. As soon as they reached the first marked location, Daniel noticed something he had somehow overlooked in every previous recording. Hidden beside each forgotten lockbox stood a short wooden post bearing a small reflective marker no larger than a silver dollar. The markers were almost invisible from a person's height because vines and branches covered them, yet they sat exactly at Buddy's eye level. One after another, Buddy trotted directly to each marker without hesitation, touching it gently with his nose before continuing forward. He was not wandering. He was following a trail intentionally built long ago for emergency responders. Nearly an hour later, they arrived at the overgrown clearing. Buddy immediately walked to the familiar circle of 3 stones, but instead of stopping there, he continued toward a weather-beaten cabin concealed behind dense trees. Daniel realized he had never noticed the structure because it blended perfectly into the hillside. The front porch sagged with age, and unopened newspapers rested beneath the mailbox. Buddy gently placed the newest key beside the front steps, then scratched once against the wooden door before sitting quietly and waiting. Several silent moments passed. Then, from inside the cabin, came the faint sound of a lock turning. The door opened only a few inches. An elderly man appeared, looking confused as he glanced at the key on the porch before slowly picking it up with trembling hands. His eyes wandered across the yard until they settled on Buddy. A gentle smile spread across his face. "You found another one," he whispered softly. "I knew you would." Daniel stood frozen. The man explained that memory loss often caused him to misplace his cabin keys during short walks along the old emergency trail. Every time he accidentally dropped one, Buddy quietly retrieved it before anyone dishonest could find it, then returned each recovered key to the cabin, patiently waiting every afternoon in hopes the owner would answer the door. The old man admitted he rarely remembered to open it because he frequently forgot what time of day it was. Buddy had never been collecting stolen keys. He had been protecting a lonely stranger from locking himself out of the only home he still recognized. Daniel felt every moment of doubt crash over him at once. He looked down at Buddy, who simply wagged his tail once before sitting beside the old man, and Daniel realized with heartbreaking clarity that the one soul everyone had suspected had been the only one who understood exactly what needed to be done. Daniel could not bring himself to speak for several long moments. Every strange memory from the past 3 weeks returned with painful clarity, but now each one carried an entirely different meaning. Buddy had never been hiding evidence. He had never been obsessed. Every pause along the trail, every carefully chosen route, every key lined up across the dining room table had been part of a patient attempt to solve a problem no human had even realized existed. Daniel remembered how Buddy had gently pushed the keys into a perfect row instead of scattering them like toys. He remembered the quiet wait beside the back door every evening, the refusal to chase squirrels, the careful way Buddy had placed each discovery at his feet before looking directly into his eyes. None of it had been random. Buddy had trusted him from the very beginning, and Daniel had answered that trust with suspicion. Dr. Grant slowly lowered the old map onto the porch railing, her expression softening as she watched Buddy calmly lean against the elderly man's leg. The old gentleman smiled with genuine warmth while absent-mindedly scratching behind Buddy's ears, almost as if this had become part of their daily routine long before anyone else noticed. Between brief moments of confusion, he quietly explained that some afternoons he would leave the cabin intending to check the old emergency boxes because they reminded him of the years he had volunteered with local search teams. On those walks, he often dropped a key without realizing it. By the time he reached home, he would discover another one missing, but before panic could settle in, Buddy would appear sometime later carrying it back. The dog never demanded attention. He simply placed the key on the porch, waited hopefully, and left only after convincing himself the cabin was safe again. Daniel felt his chest tighten as he imagined how many evenings Buddy must have repeated that quiet mission while everyone in town whispered that he had become a nuisance. Even the officer who had questioned him, the neighbors who stepped away from Buddy, and Daniel himself had all misunderstood the same acts of loyalty. Buddy had carried that burden without changing his gentle nature once. He never barked in protest. He never stopped trying. Instead, he continued protecting someone who could no longer fully protect himself. Daniel slowly knelt beside Buddy until they were face to face. Buddy responded exactly as he always had, giving one soft wag of his tail before resting his head against Daniel's shoulder. There was no resentment in him, no hesitation, no sign that he remembered being doubted. That simple act of trust hurt Daniel more than any accusation ever could. Dr. Grant quietly stepped aside, allowing the moment to belong entirely to them. After several minutes, Daniel stood and gently gathered every recovered key from his backpack before placing them into the elderly man's hands one by one. Then he looked toward the aging cabin, the overgrown trail, and the forgotten emergency route stretching back through the forest. He finally understood why Buddy had never wanted to abandon that path. Before leaving, Daniel made a promise that surprised even himself. He would cancel every plan to send Buddy for behavioral treatment, speak personally with the neighbors and the police officer, help organize regular visits to the isolated cabin, and make sure Buddy would never again have to carry the responsibility of protecting that lonely place all by himself. As Buddy quietly walked toward the trail once more, Daniel did not call him back. Instead, For the first time since the mystery had begun, he chose to follow where Buddy was leading. The changes began quietly, almost so quietly that most people in town never realized they had started because of one patient dog. Within a week, Daniel worked with Dr. Grant, the county archives office, and several volunteers to restore the forgotten emergency trail instead of letting it disappear beneath weeds and fallen branches. Small reflective markers were cleaned, the old lockboxes were documented, and new duplicate keys were placed where they belonged so the elderly cabin owner would never again have to depend on fading memories alone. No one announced the project with speeches or ceremonies. It simply became something neighbors chose to do after learning the truth. The same people who had once whispered about Buddy now found themselves asking Daniel if they could help clear brush, repair broken signs, or check on the old cabin during the week. The greatest surprise came from the children in the neighborhood. They began calling the winding forest path Buddy's Trail, not because anyone officially named it that way, but because every family understood who had quietly protected it when everyone else had forgotten it existed. Daniel noticed something changing in Buddy as well. For the first time in weeks, Buddy no longer rushed out the back door every afternoon carrying the invisible weight of responsibility alone. Instead, when Daniel picked up his hiking boots after work, Buddy calmly waited beside them until they left together. The old routine had become a shared promise instead of a lonely mission. Some afternoons, they brought groceries to the cabin. Other days, they simply sat on the weathered porch while the elderly man shared stories from years he still remembered clearly. On difficult days, when his memory drifted away again, Buddy seemed to understand without needing words. He quietly rested nearby, never demanding attention, never becoming restless, simply offering the steady presence that had guided him from the beginning. Daniel finally realized that Buddy had never been trying to solve a mystery. He had been preserving someone's dignity one small act at a time. One Saturday morning, the neighborhood association organized a community breakfast in the local park. Daniel expected an ordinary gathering, but as he arrived, he noticed a long table covered with dozens of old keys that residents had voluntarily brought from their homes. Each one carried a handwritten tag explaining where it belonged and who should be called if it was ever found. Smiling neighbors thanked Buddy not with applause or loud celebration, but by making sure no lost key would ever become another forgotten burden for someone living alone. Even the police officer who had questioned Daniel earlier quietly attached a new identification tag to the emergency trail map and admitted that sometimes the smallest clues deserve the most careful attention. Buddy wandered peacefully among the families, accepting gentle pats from children and seniors alike before returning to Daniel's side. As the afternoon sun settled across the park, the elderly cabin owner slowly approached carrying a simple wooden box. Inside rested the very first brass key Buddy had ever returned, polished until it reflected the light like new. Rather than keeping it locked away, the old man placed it on a small display beside a handwritten note that read, "Sometimes the one who cannot explain is the one showing us the way." Buddy looked at the familiar key for only a brief moment before quietly lying down at Daniel's feet, letting out the deepest, most contented sigh Daniel had heard in weeks, as though he finally understood that the burden he had carried alone no longer belonged only to him. Autumn arrived quietly, and with it came a rhythm that felt as dependable as the sunrise. Every Saturday morning, Daniel and Buddy followed the restored trail together, stopping at each marker not because they still needed to search for missing keys, but because the walk itself had become a promise they refused to break. Sometimes they found the elderly cabin owner waiting on the porch with fresh coffee for Daniel and a small biscuit tucked carefully into his shirt pocket for Buddy. Other times the cabin was empty while the old man rested with relatives who now visited regularly. Yet Buddy always paused at the front steps for a moment before continuing down the trail with peaceful confidence. It was no longer a journey driven by worry. It had become a quiet tradition built on trust. As the seasons changed, more people discovered the little wooden display beside the cabin where the polished brass key rested beneath its handwritten note. Visitors often stood there longer than they expected. Some smiled. Some grew silent. Many found themselves reaching into their own pockets to double-check their keys before walking away, not because they feared losing them, but because they suddenly thought about the people who might be waiting for them at home. Daniel noticed that Buddy rarely looked at the display anymore. The dog seemed content simply knowing everything was finally where it belonged. Even the neighborhood changed in subtle ways that no one could measure. Spare keys were labeled. Elderly residents checked on one another more often. Children learned the story while walking the forest trail with their parents, and instead of hearing a lesson about cleverness, they heard one about paying attention before making assumptions. Whenever someone new asked why the path carried Buddy's name, Daniel never began with the mystery of the keys. He always started with the mistake he himself had made. He admitted how easy it had been to mistake quiet determination for strange behavior, how quickly fear had replaced trust, and how close he had come to taking away the very friend who had been trying to help someone else every single day. He believed that part of the story mattered just as much as everything Buddy had done, because remembering our own mistakes was the only way to avoid repeating them. Years later, after the trail had become a familiar landmark in the community, Daniel found one final surprise waiting beside the display case. Resting beneath the polished brass key was a brand new key attached to a small carved wooden tag. There was no note explaining who had left it there. Only two simple words had been carefully engraved into the wood. "Keep looking." Daniel smiled as Buddy gently touched the tag with his nose before turning toward the path they had walked together so many times. The dog no longer searched because something was lost. He walked because someone had finally chosen to understand. And perhaps that is the rarest key any heart can ever find.